Welcome to our podcast, We're Not So Different.
I'm Samira.
And I'm Ali. We're two professionals having real conversations about our experiences at home, work, and out in the community.
We tell our stories through the lens of our different backgrounds to just find out that we're not so different.
In our podcast, we'll explore ways that we can improve engagement and bridge social gaps while trying to find the humor in it all.
Check us out on social media at wnsdifferent or email us at wnsdifferent@gmail.com. Welcome everybody to another episode of We're Not So Different podcast. I'm Samira with my co-host Ali. And today we have a special guest for you. His name is Gerson Sanchez, and he is a very young Ph.D. candidate, activist, and he also runs the Instagram page, Woke Wednesdays. Thanks for joining us for this episode. Why don't you go ahead and let our listeners know a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Hey, what's up, y'all? Thank you so much, first of all, to the two of you for having me on here on your podcast. Very excited to be here. My name is Gerson Sanchez. As you said, I am a PhD candidate at Florida International University in Miami, Florida. And my research centers around activism and the different ways that it manifests in our world. And yes, I also am the founder and host of Woke Wednesdays. It's a social justice Instagram page that I started on January 25th, 2017, in the wake of Donald Trump being voted into office. So yes, that's what I've been doing. And yeah, I guess that's a little bit about me.
Was there something specific about Donald Trump's candidacy and presidency that made you decide, that triggered you and or inspired you to decide to be an activist?
I guess that's a loaded question. But I think that certain moments, I guess, tend to politicize people in certain ways. And I had also just started my doctoral program. And I think the combination of that, and I think wanting to be able to speak about things from, I guess, in an insightful way, I guess through the academy and what I was learning, the combination of all that kind of led me to start Woke Wednesdays. Woke Wednesdays, in many ways, I think was an accident. I just wanted to do one episode initially. I never planned for it to become a whole thing. And I guess friends started motivating me to start a page, and little by little, it started growing, and it's almost at 50,000 followers now, which is unbelievable. I can't even fathom that.
So that's awesome.
That is awesome. So one thing I'm curious about is, for our listeners, can you tell us a little bit about what is Woke Wednesdays, how you came up with the name, as well as, like, I know you mentioned activism, but is there something specific within activism you highlight on your Instagram page?
Yeah, sure. So I remember a couple of weeks prior to starting Woke Wednesdays, I had a homeboy, and he had this thing on Tuesdays. And I forgot what it was called, but I remember he used to talk about race. And I was like, man, if he's doing that, like, why can't I do that? So I wanted to do it on Wednesdays. And the reason I chose Wednesdays was because I didn't have any classes that day. So woke at the time was like a pretty common word. A lot of people were using it. Now, to me, the word is just kind of corny and overused at times. But at that particular time, I was like, yeah, that's cool. How about something like Woke Wednesdays? And I remember I was dating this girl at the time, and I was like, hey, what are your thoughts? She's like, oh, that's cool. That sounds cool. She approved of it. So it started. Her and I are no longer together, thank goodness. Woke Wednesdays is still very much together, and we're trying to do some cool things with the show. And it's interesting because a lot of people sometimes get angry and will write me, DMs like, you're not addressing this social identity, or you're not addressing this topic. And I'm like, and I understand why someone would be upset. And I guess what I try to think about is that something can be good and not everything at the same time. Luckily, there are other people, on social media platforms also addressing issues that pertain to human suffering. So, and I think that's great. And I think we can collaborate, and I think we can learn from one another. So I think my page is mostly, I think, around issues pertaining to race and racism. gender, patriarchy, and sexual orientation.
Hmm.
I wish I did more stuff on like capitalism and social class, but I guess those are the things that I gravitate to more. And also, the United States is a hyper racial country, so I feel, and as a racialized being, I also think of myself in certain racial ways. So I think I feel more comfortable addressing race. So I think that's what the page is mostly geared to. But then so the page is one thing, and then I also do the show, and the show addresses everything and anything, any topic that comes to mind, or any whatever makes me angry, is usually what I focus on with the show. The show is Woke Wednesdays. Initially, I used to do the show every single Wednesday at 9 p.m. and I did that for about 2.5 years. I never missed a Wednesday. I did over 100 episodes every single Wednesday at 9 p.m. I had different guests on the show, and through Instagram Live, we would have a talk show basically. And even when I traveled to different states, I would even do the show there. So it was great and I loved it. But then as I started doing my dissertation work, I had to stop doing it because it was just too much. So now recently, so initially we used to do it through Instagram Live and we would record from my couch. But now, luckily, I had a sponsor, and they actually really wanted to up the level of production with Woke Wednesdays. So we recently started recording in a professional television studio. We did that on Saturday, actually, for the first time. We shot 4 episodes. It was a long day. A lot of stuff went into it, and that's going to start airing in the next 2 to 3 weeks. Every Wednesday, we're going to try to drop an episode. So we're going to have our season one, and season one is going to be comprised of 8 episodes. So that's the plan for right now, and we have a couple other projects like in the works right now.
I was gonna say I was looking. I saw those posts that you had put up recording, and I hadn't seen any of those before. So that makes sense. So that congratulations. That's
Thank
awesome
you. I
uh,
appreciate it.
that you got that.
Thank
Can you tell us a little bit more about your dissertation and what it brought? You know, what drove you to go into that?
Yeah.
Getting your PhD is not an easy feat.
Yeah, it's been a wild journey, to say the least. I'm also first generation, so it feels like you're constantly just trying to keep up, uh, as you're going through these kind of journeys. Um, but I remember trying to pick a topic, and at this point, I had already been doing Woke Wednesdays for a while, and I remember I had been reading so much, and everything just kind of fascinated me. And I sat down with my professor, and I was like, "Hey, like I don't really know what I should do for a topic." And we started talking and talking and talking, and finally, he's like, "You're doing this thing with Woke Wednesdays, and it's activism." He's like, "Why not do a dissertation on activism?" And I was like, "Oh wow, like I hadn't even thought about that. I didn't." Sometimes I guess I feel like I can't really intellectualize that which is personal to me. And in that
Hmm.
moment, I was like, maybe I can. Maybe I can, study something that I love to do. So that's how that happened. And I remember that activism means many things to many people. A lot of people have critiqued the little black square that people posted. And I think that oftentimes so language is a very interesting thing as it, I guess, the role that it takes in our social lives. And I think that oftentimes we tend to misuse certain words. And I think activism is one of those words that is at times misused because at times we don't really understand what it means, like its etymology, the root of the word, which is fine. But I think sometimes when we misuse words, it can also foreclose certain ways of being, certain ways of acting, and certain ways of pushing politics forward for the good of, I think, all people. So the more I got into the study of activism, the more I guess it opened up trains of thought for me. Yeah, so I guess when it comes to activism, I've luckily now I've written some stuff on it. I've read a lot about it, so I know a little bit more. I just submitted my dissertation draft, my first draft, a couple weeks ago, and I just got my review back today. So there's a lot of shit I got to fix on it, but ultimately, I think it'll make me a better scholar. But yeah, I think activism can mean many things, and we can talk about that too if you'd like. But yeah, that's how I kind of came up with my topic.
Can you go into when you were talking about the meaning of activism and the root of it? Can you elaborate for Ali and myself and our listeners?
So traditionally, activism has been thought of like protest or boycotting or sit-ins. I'm from Greensboro, North Carolina. So one of the things that Greensboro is known for is the sit-ins that took place against just racism and just segregation and Jim Crow. And that's great. We need all types of activisms. That's really kind of like my argument in my dissertation, that we need to be creative with our activisms, because it's not just that. The etymology or the root of the word active means to move, to move something or a person in a particular way. And then when you put ism at the end of it, it's the practice of. So when you put these things together, it's the practice of trying to move people in particular ways.
Mhm.
And what I see with what I saw with my research is that maybe emotions are one of the things that propel us to move in numerous ways. When something makes you angry, you act in a type of way. When something makes you happy, you act in a type of way. When something makes you sad, you act in a type of way. So emotions are in a way activators for us as social beings. So when I see something like the black box on Instagram, I see that as something that could potentially activate somebody, because we never know how far the ripples go. We don't know at what point something changes somebody. Like it took me a long time, to like reading certain things to get me to think in a particular way, to get me to act in a particular way. So I guess what I'm arguing for is that we should have that numerous things activate us, including our emotions. And that's where I kind of go into it with my dissertation and my research. So yeah, so I think not all activators are necessarily good. Some can be evil. Some can be used for nefarious purposes. But I think paying attention to the numerous ways in which we activate people is important. And what I saw with my research is that for some reason there's something about children who grow up in marginalized communities and they understand themselves as such, as someone who is growing up in a marginalized community. These children end up kind of taking a role in the way we tend to activate others. So many people that you talk to, like the reason you all started this podcast, I am assuming, is that there are particular experiences that you had in your life that led you, activated you, and moved you to try to do something for the betterment of people. And this is clearly a social justice podcast. So this is a way that you all enter the political realm of political activism. So those emotions and those experiences activated y'all and moved y'all to do this, is what I'm assuming. In a sense, you were activated by other things, other people's, by memories, by experiences. And I guess that's what I'm trying to address in my dissertation.
What emotions provoke people to become activated?
Yeah, that is as a chapter in my dissertation, but I'm also looking at the experiences that lead people to act in particular ways. I call it moments of activation. So, what is it about someone who was pulled over by the police as a child and brutalized by the police? Like
Mhm.
that moment there activates somebody to act in a particular way. And for my research participants, one of them, it led them to start reading about, systems of oppression. It led them to be a political organizer in Miami. So those experiences led him to do that. Those experiences also make him mad and angry. And outrage is perhaps a, I want to say, a good thing when it comes to activism. Prolonged outrage, because when someone is appeased, when someone is made to feel better about a particular situation, we tend to kind of slow down. We tend to kind of acquiesce or just say, okay, this was fixed. A solution
Yeah.
was provided ostensibly. But when someone is outraged, when there is anger involved, we tend to want to push more. So, which is an interesting argument when it comes to reparations. The argument of reparations is a certain community is asking for something due to the historical and present just abuse and just a constant oppression. But what I'm scared of, and which I'm completely for, but what I'm scared of is that if a reparations was actually given, that this would then appease certain communities. Because if we give a type of, and reparations is oftentimes thought in like monetary terms. So if there was a monetary payout, and we call that reparations, this does not mean that systemic racism goes away. It does not mean that police brutality goes away. It does not mean that any of these things go away. It just means that there's an economic payout. I'm not against that, but what I'm trying to think through, and again, I'm not really committed to my thoughts. Like I change my ideas every day when I hear something, when I read something. So this is what I'm thinking about right now, is that if we were to pay out a type of reparations, it would appease. It would be a purported, I guess, solution. And then maybe this would kind of almost kill the movement.
Mm. So it
Uh,
could end up being more like hush money versus actual reparations. Like, hey,
Maybe, yeah, like reparations can mean many things, but the point is that systemic racism still won't go away, even with that. And I'm afraid that especially politicians will be like, "We already gave you your money, stop complaining," kind of thing.
right, and their supporters would fall in line with that as well.
Yeah, and that can fuck up a movement. So I think there's like a tension there. I'm all for communities being funded and people being given, like I'm all for that. But I'm just I guess I'm trying to think of some of the consequences that might inevitably come with that, um, which I think is important for us to think about and think through. It's a controversial and a complicated argument, but I think it's an important one. So
I I would have to agree with you on that because and if you've heard any other or joined us on our IG live ever, we've had a lot of conversations about Reparation Island, run by Ali, but that's a whole other conversation. But I would agree that it's important to solve the problems, the root cause of the problems, versus just addressing the symptoms and of those problems. To your point, giving someone reparations without actually fixing the solution isn't going to solve anything in the long run. There needs to be a plan to be able to do both, to make people whole, but also fix the system so that we don't repeat history, we don't do the same things, and we don't perpetuate these negative stereotypes and keep these systems that are holding people back.
yeah, and that's part of the what adds to the complexity of this, that it's numerous systems working like together.
Yeah.
Um, it's interesting. I had a really weird thing happen to me. I uh I had to give like a speech at this at a nonprofit organization, and the day of I was trying to print the speech. It was like 4 in the morning. I woke up extra early. I was trying to print it out, and my printer ran out of ink. So I'm like, oh shit, I gotta go get some ink for the printer. So luckily, it was like a Walmart that's like open 24 hours. So I went, got the ink, came back home, put the cartridges in the printer, and the shit wouldn't work. I was like, what the fuck? I got the right ink. Why is this shit not printing? And I opened it up, and to my demise, what I didn't realize was that there's like this little small yellow piece of paper on the cartridge that apparently you have to take off
Yeah.
in order for the shit to work. And I was like amazed by this because I was like, the printer in and of itself is a type of system. There are multiple working parts, moving parts that make this machine work. But sometimes it's the little shit, that little piece of paper that can fuck up the entire thing. And I was thinking about this in relation to systemic forms of oppression and about how we're oftentimes trying to find a solution to systemic forms of suffering. But I think sometimes we take for granted the small things, like the small wrenches that could actually fuck up the whole system. And I think what we're seeing now, even with like that little Instagram, the little black box, a lot of people critiqued it, and I understand their critiques, and rightfully so, I get it. But I think that sometimes we don't realize how something so small can also be so good for a movement. Um, because to someone who's never really engaged with systemic racism or thought about it, for them to post something like that, it's like, okay, it's a starting point for somebody. There's somebody else that might not be. And we also don't know what that person's follower might do when they see a black box like that. Maybe they're like, huh, what is this black box? And that leads them to do some research and be like, oh shit, this is happening. There are certain things that sometimes we don't see it as fruitful, but they actually might be, especially in the long run.
Yeah, that makes sense. I will throw in a comment about reparations as being one of the recipients, if there were reparations in the room. But I'll put this in there as food for thought. So I understand the angle in which you're coming from, because you're right. If you give someone a check and you continue, just like in a domestic violence relationship, right? You pay somebody off, but you continue to beat them. It doesn't change the system. But I think there are some key things that we want to recognize. Is one, obviously, you agree with, 250 years of free labor is has a value,
Mhm.
right? Cotton, tobacco, sugar cane, establishing the wealth of an entire country, that's worth trillions upon trillions of
Yeah.
dollars today, has a value. But one thing that I like to look back on from a historical perspective are some of the leaders that existed back in that time. When we think about Marcus Garvey, we think about Malcolm X, and even we think about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In the twilight of his time. A lot of the focus and the emphasis, especially from Marcus Garvey, was about having and doing those things that just empowered you on an economic standpoint. So to your point, and Samir and I have had this conversation. If it's kind of like the Dave Chappelle episode. You give a bunch of folks reparations right now, be people driving around with a truck full of Newports, right? But if you empower people from an economic standpoint and they spend within their own communities and they create their own systems within their own communities, specifically those around groceries, finances like banking, and kind of your everyday services. You then internalize that money, you turn it over in your own community multiple times. So I think, to your point, the conversation about reparations is very layered, from both the socioeconomic piece of it, the financial aspect of it, and then you're right. What good does it do if the system still is at hand? But I think there are economic ways when you have that amount of power, and you even have that amount of power in the African American community without reparations, right? Just when we talk about turning over dollars in your own community, so that's a very interesting thing. And I think when you're done with your paper, I'd love to read the piece on reparations. But I do agree when we start to think about, how exactly do you go about tearing down a system, and how does it benefit you if everyone is not necessarily at the place where they should be when you start handing out checks, right? If one person is taking a check and going and buying a Ferrari and walking off, and the other person is starting a business, that's going to be two different outcomes, right? One person is just going to get beat down by the police in the Ferrari, and the other person is going to have establish a way of creating wealth for their economy and their community over and over again. So
And helping giving people other options so
yeah,
that we can.
Also the idea of someone buying a Ferrari is like is it's a very interesting example because I think it also reveals what we also think about particular people and particular social economic classes. Because there's been a lot of like research about and what people do with their money. So oftentimes people talk about financial literacy, and I find that almost insulting, especially because it's very much targeted to poor people. And I'm like, name a group of people more resilient than poor people. Like I know my mom, like this woman, single mother, and constantly clean houses, and somehow this lady can stretch a dollar. I don't know how the hell she does it.
yeah, making
Yeah.
something out of nothing, right? Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's wild. So it's most poor people actually work multiple jobs, like to stay afloat, to survive. So it is interesting. Like you said it perfectly. The conversation of reparations is extremely layered, extremely layered. Again, we're talking about numerous systems at play. Like it's yeah, it almost seems like unimaginable. Um,
Yeah, I want to touch on that because I think you bring up a good point. There's this hustler mentality, survival mentality that is had where you do what you have to do to survive. You clean, you cook, you sew, you babysit, you do whatever you can to make ends meet. And I think where we could do better with financial literacy is, what do you do when you actually do have a better income, and how are you using that money? Like, how are you investing in yourselves? And I think the challenge is that a lot of people, once they start making money, then they want to go for a lot of the tangible items, the shoes, the shirts, the
But that's
brand name things, instead of being educated in the point of like, well, sure, you can get that, and you could also invest in this or put your money here and have it grow for you. So in like 6 months you have more money, or continue to save. So I do agree that people dismiss that, the part you spoke to about the hustling and the script, working so hard to make ends meet. And one of the challenges I've seen is that you know people are having a hard time of even getting to a point where they can talk about financial literacy, because they're still just surviving.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, again, this idea that people buy tangible things to make them happy. Number one, like, we all do that type of stuff. Like, this is
Mhm.
not just like a poor person thing. Like, we all engage in those types of activities, regardless of your social class. Maybe those that are extremely elite don't, but I think even them, they still do.
Yeah, even they do. Everybody,
Yeah.
rich people are nothing but poor people with money. Like, let's be clear. Human behavior is the
Like,
same regardless, right?
so there's another thing that is systemic. We said that you said that sometimes people who, once they start making some money, well, what we do know is that rarely, very rarely happens, actually. Like,
Yeah,
so having a living wage in the United States is like radical. Like, even talking about that. I live in Miami, and I'm pretty sure minimum wage is like, I think, $8 or something terrible. I don't even know what it is now. It's
Mhm.
horrible, absolutely horrible. And bringing up saying that people should get paid $15 an hour as a minimum is it's unfathomable. So
Yeah.
even so, poor people again oftentimes work more than one job to survive.
Yep.
So even the idea that they can start making some money is already like false for the most part. And this is part of what, when we talk about capitalism, what capitalism is, a very alluring and seductive idea. It is the part of it is the idea that people can actually make money and actually be rich one day. That is patently false. We absolutely know this. We know that the top 1% of people in America own more than 41% of the wealth. When it comes
Mhm.
to black communities or black folks, the top 1% of black folks own more than 70% of the wealth of all black people. So why is this? Like, why does this exist? How does this happen? And I think having a framework of capitalism is very helpful because it allows us to see that oftentimes people actually will stay in the same economic position that they were born into, which is why this is another form of systemic oppression. There's this almost just patently false belief that if you go to school, you will make more money. If you go to college, you will make more money. This is actually false. What ends up happening is that you have a whole class of people who go to college and get a degree. Now, jobs have a bigger pool to choose from. When you have a bigger pool to choose from, you don't have to pay them as much. So there is this belief in and there's actually a great scholar where he argues that maybe the way out of poverty isn't going to college; it's actually giving people a living wage, whatever that is. But yeah, oh, John Marsh, that's his name, John Marsh. So this is what he's arguing. He's arguing that instead of going to college, if you want people to get out of poverty, is to pay them a living wage, and let's see what happens.
Mhm.
But again, this seems so unimaginable because it's a theory that we're yet to put to the test. So I think when we talk about people like making more money and they go buy the Ferraris or the shoes or the tangible things, number one, we all engage in that type of behavior, and number two, I think I would even question, how do we even know that that is what happens? Because maybe we've seen a couple people do it. A couple of people isn't most people. So I even question that. Like, how do we even come to know that that is a reality for most people?
yeah. So I did want to kind of rebound on the capitalism thing, but I do want to ask you about when we talk about activism, right? Yes, we had the George Floyd incident, and that's popular. But one thing that has been a running theme in relation to our Latino brothers and sisters specifically has been this idea that immigration is bad for the country, the idea that anyone from south of the border is bad for the country, the idea that even if you're born here, you still should go back and whatnot. So I wanted to touch on your activism related specifically that community, and then also I wanted to actually get some clarification. Hispanic, Latino, Latina, Latinx, like what should people be using, or does it matter?
All right, so the first part of the question was, how do I engage in activism in relation to Latin people?
Yeah, let's switch it up. Let's go with Hispanic, Latino,
Let's define it
yeah,
first.
Latinx. Like you hear those terms thrown around. What do those mean, and what do people often have a preference? And then let's go into the activism around it.
Yeah, so what I've learned is that these words can mean many things for many different people. So, and it's funny because I see a lot of like Instagram videos that come up or YouTube videos where people occasionally or define these words according, to whatever they're reading, to whatever they're, studying, or whatever their experience is. So I want to preface that. So even whatever I say, someone might be like, "Oh, that's not what that word means to me." Sometimes there is no one definition. Again, like words are words. They're created by people, so they're constantly changing. So Hispanic, I think we spoke about this when we were on the phone the other day, is a relatively new word. So the U.S. Census in the 1930s, they had the word Mexican in there. Then it was
Hmm.
taken out, and then it wasn't until the 1980s that the word Hispanic was introduced, 70s and 80s, in the U.S. Census. This was by the Office of Budget and Management, I believe, the United States federal government. So they're the ones who create the census. So this word comes into kind of the American lexicon a couple of years, like so a couple of decades ago. So it usually tends to mean someone who speaks Spanish or is of Spanish origin, or someone who comes from a Spanish speaking country. So that those are some definitions for that word. Some other people might take exception to it, but that's what I think. And then Latino Latina is usually someone who comes from a Latin American country. So the funny thing is that people don't become Hispanic or Latino or Latina until they are in the United States. It is redundant to say that you're Latino or Latina outside of the United States. Like if you're
Correct.
in Nicaragua or Guatemala, people don't walk around saying I'm Latino, I'm Hispanic. That's absurd. Which is interesting because that would mean that Hispanic, Latino, or Latina is actually an American or a Western production that
Yep.
we are invented by the West. There's a phenomenal book called Orientalism by the great Edward Said. He's a Palestinian scholar, beautiful writer, and he talks about how the Orient, or how, well, he by that he meant the Middle East, was actually a creation of the West. So really, I recommend that people read it. But so it's interesting when we think about Latin people or Hispanic people, and about how we are in ourselves a type of production. How even blackness is a type of, we could argue, a type of American production. So controversial arguments, and I'm always down to have those. But it's something to think about. What does that even mean? So recently, a lot of scholars. So there's this thing called critical race theory, but then there's also Latin critical race theory. And what these scholars have argued is that they take exception to the word Hispanic, because Hispanic is to almost, and this is what they argue, that it extols or lauds or praises the colonizer being Spain. So the reason most
Hmm.
of us speak Spanish is because we were colonized by the Spanish. So some people reject that word, some people hate it. I know people who fucking hate that word. Like, don't call me fucking Hispanic. Like, and people get upset about this. It's a real thing. So that's Hispanic. So, and then Latino, Latina. But the thing with Latino or Latina is that it tends to imply a type of, gender identification.
Hmm.
So recently, people have been using the word Latinx, And that can mean many things as well. Typically, it means someone who has Latin American origins, who, and this is supposed to be more gender inclusive. And what I like about it, one of my homeboys put me onto this, and he's like, part of what Latinx does is that it disrupts our kind of normative understandings of Latino, Latina, and Hispanic. So when you use a term like Latinx, it automatically disrupts what people tend to use. And then we're able to have a conversation about why we use that word and how it is gender inclusive. So I think that's a pretty cool take on it. I think when people refer to me, I actually don't give a fuck like what word people use for me. I think we're oftentimes labeled many things in our lives, whether we know it or not.
Yeah.
So this is a label to me that is like I just don't care enough. Like when I was a kid growing up in the South, I would be called Mexican, and I
Right.
remember becoming upset. I'm Mexican. I'm not Mexican. Now I don't give a shit. I think I embrace it at times, and I would say that sometimes I am politically Mexican. So I can be
Yeah.
in the South, and someone refers to me as Mexican, and that might give me an opportunity to address particular issues. And if I'm racialized as Mexican, that means that there are certain political consequences that might come with that. And again, I think I can use that as an educational moment. So yeah, so these terms can mean many things to many people. Some people get it, some people don't. One of the interesting things is what kind of a person gets upset with this type of word, Hispanic especially. It's usually someone who's had some type of academic training. It's someone who's studied something about Latin or Hispanic or whatever. Other people don't take exception to it, and sometimes it's because they haven't studied this stuff. So
Yeah.
sometimes it almost comes off as this kind of boutique multiculturalism kind of stance. And so I think that's important too because I'm like, okay, you're taking exception to this word and I get it and I respect it, but then don't get mad at somebody else because they want to this is the only word they have in their language available to them. This is the term they use. This is the term they grew up using. Not everyone gets to go on and have a doctorate. In fact, most people don't. So not everyone studies Latin American history. Most people don't.
Right.
So I think sometimes when people like get upset with other people because they're not using the quote unquote correct terminology, I'm like, hey, dude, like chill because it almost comes off as like a type of elitism. Um,
Yeah, we see
so
that too in the Persian community. Like people don't want to be called Iranian, so they call themselves Persian
mm,
for whatever reason. But I'm with you. I'm like, whatever, it's Iran.
I just don't care.
So
Like I just don't. And then next week it'll be another word that we use.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Like
So let's talk about the activism around Hispanic, Latino, Latina, Latinx, and all of the above for you. What does that look like, and how does that manifest?
And how can people show up as allies?
yeah, so it's wild, man. Like I guess when we say activism, I guess it can mean again activism can mean many things. And I think for me in particular, I think sometimes my very own existence is a type of activism. So I I think both of you, your very existence in a particular space might already be disruptive. So in your particular job, sometimes your very existence, because the way you look, the way you speak, the things you care about is already disruptive in a particular space. I don't know if you've ever had the experience where it's like, oh, there they go again, talking about, race, gender, whatever. Your very existence in this world is already a disruption to that space,
Right.
and to that place. There's one scholar who her name is Doreen Massey. She has a book called For Space. And one thing that she argues is that there's a difference between space and place. Space, part of what comprises the idea of space for her is that it comes to exist through interactions. So, for example, we could be in the same room, and the room could be the place. But then you're in one corner talking with, Ali, and just the two of you, and that's your own space because you're creating it through your interactions with each other, despite being in the same place where I could be in the other corner, having my own space. So I think that is important. So your very politics, your very disposition to life, your very physicality, the way you look is already disruptive to a space. And I think that's a type of activism. So for me, I think in the way I think about things, the way I talk about things, I could be at the gym, I could be at the bar, I could be wherever. But if I hear someone call somebody illegal, I'm already going. Most likely, I will probably say something. Usually, I wear a lot of political T-shirts. So, some one of the shirts I have, it says "No human is illegal on stolen land." So wearing that type of shirt to a place is already disruptive. Wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt when you're not black is already disruptive to a particular space. So we talk about
Right.
allyship, or I usually don't use those words, but like I get it. I think that's a type of way again to kind of enter to be an activist, to activate other people to do certain things. So I think when it comes to Latin people, I approach it like that. That's one of the ways I approach it. So being in a room like on campus where I'm the only Latin person and I have to address certain things, I think that's a way to be an activist. When I'm working, when I'm at another place, like it's I think it's a constant work. One of my homegirls just finished a dissertation on something called cultural taxation, on all the ways that individuals who are marginalized are constantly taxed, like through everything they do. Like they ask you to be the diversity person. They ask you to talk about race. Oh shit, I got a question about, Iran. Oh yep, I know exactly who to talk to. Like all these things that constantly tax us as individuals. So I think when it comes to activism, I do that. I also try to use social media to politically organize. So when there were going to be protests outside the ICE camps in South Florida, sharing that information, disseminating that information, trying to be someone who was mobilizing people. So I think those are all ways that we do things. And I think also protecting people is an important thing. So right, my mom has lupus, and I live in the hotspot of COVID-19. So part of the way I protect my mom is by not going to see her. And my mom
Yeah.
is a working class Latina woman. I think that's important too, protecting the most vulnerable of our populations. So I think that's another form of activism. So I think there are so many ways to be an activist. No one has a monopoly on activism, and I think that's a good thing. Even though sometimes we try to pretend like we do. So I think those are all kind of, so at least some of the ways that I can just think of for right now that I try to be an activist.
Yeah, let's expound on that a little bit, especially from the Latin perspective. It is Hispanic Heritage Month. But when we think about the history of the country, we think about, we're in California, which used to be Mexico. We think about the Spanish coming over, the conquistadors. We think about the history of the Incas, the Mayans, the Aztecas, the Tainos, and all the people that were destroyed over time through colonization. If there's something that comes to mind for you around not just the contribution, but just understanding the right of existence, if you will. And that's what I think. That's just my own kind of take on it. The right of existence of the native and indigenous person, the right of existence for those who are the much disenfranchised children of the Spanish and the natives. When you think about those sorts of things from a historical standpoint, and you think about fast forwarding to now, where you know people who stole the land are telling you to go back, or telling your people to go back, or have a healthy ignorance of history. What does that bring about for you from an emotional perspective, and also
Yeah,
what is your message for people? Because you mentioned speaking up when someone in the store says someone is illegal, but that's part of that ignorance, right? So,
yeah.
what is your message for those folks,
You know,
and how do you feel about that?
I like how you worded that healthy ignorance. I like that. I'm gonna have to use that. I like that. It's wild. And I'm gonna this is like my way into answering your question, at least. Again, let's say I wear a Black Lives Matter shirt or something like that, or I've often heard from people, oh, Hearst is just trying to be black. That's what I've heard, because most of my friends are black. I hang out predominantly black spaces and places. So I always hear, oh, Hearst is trying to be black, and I'm like, this is fascinating. I'm like, because I support and I feel comfortable and safe around a particular group of people. This means I'm trying to be something, as if me needing to be something is the reason for me having to care. I'm like,
Mhm.
and I hate that logic, And I think as I'm trying to answer your question, I think all people should be outraged by human suffering.
Yeah.
So to me, when I see someone being ridiculed or bullied because they're gay, because they're trans, I'm not a gay man. I'm not a trans man. I don't know what that experience is like. But what I do know is that this person is suffering, and no one should need to suffer. Period. Um, so I can stand in solidarity with that. I don't know what it's like to be a woman, but if something is going on there, I don't need to be a woman to be able to be like, yo, this is fucked up. So I think it's important. I think when we talk about allyship and all that type of stuff, I'm like, I think we should all be outraged when shit is going on, when things are happening. Most recently, we saw that in ICE camps in Georgia, immigrant women, or those who are deemed as immigrants, are they're going through forced hysterectomies. So they're
Yeah.
literally, you know, their opportunity to have a child is being stripped from them. So we see these things, and we should be completely outraged. We should all be outraged. No, it shouldn't have to take someone being Latino, Latina, or whatever word we're using to describe ourselves to be angry and upset about this. So I think that's an important disclaimer for me. How does it make me feel? It makes me feel horrible. Sometimes I can't sleep at night. Sometimes, I wake up just angry, just disgusted at the world. It makes me feel terrible. Uh, so the constant abuse that people are subjected to, and yeah. So as far as the contributions, it's really weird the way we justify immigration in this country. Um, Oftentimes one of the main arguments is that because so many Latin people contribute to the economy, this is why we should allow them to be here. So they work so hard, they pick our fruits and our vegetables, they pay taxes, so they should be able to live here. And I'm like, this economic justification is disgusting, um, because this is what we're trying to use to say that people should be able to live like in peace and harmony, um, because of how hard they work. So to me, I just kind of find it just appalling and insulting. Uh, so yeah, to answer your question, I'm disgusted by all this shit. It's terrible. When you learn that Mexican people were lynched in this country, um, Mexican women were lynched because they didn't want to be raped, so they got lynched. When we see that in Puerto Rico, the U.S. government was experimenting on those people during World War II. Uh, there's a great book that just came out. I think it's called How to Hide an Empire, uh, and where they go into where the author talks about this, about what happened in Puerto Rico. So, or we talk about the Wetback Act, I believe. I think it was 1954. The Braceros program was a program where the United States went into Mexico to get basically people to do their labor here, and then once they were done with them, they literally just deported them back, and that was the Wetback Act. So feel free, please fact check me. I think it's 1954. So you think about all these things. My family's from Nicaragua, so you look at 1980s, the role of the CIA going into Nicaragua, like, and this is a form of U.S. imperialism and funding the Contras, and these drugs were disseminated in California. So like, and so
Yeah.
you can't make this shit up. Like you can't. So the more James Baldwin said, to be black and conscious is to constantly live in a state of rage.
Rage. Absolutely.
And one of my homeboys told me once, to be native and conscious is to live in constant mourning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and they're an indigenous person from Colombia, South America. So, yeah, I think the more you learn about how horrible this country has been and continues to be, especially to the least of these, those who are the most vulnerable, it should outrage all of us. It, and yeah, and I wish and I guess I wish it would outrage more people. But I guess with that comes a type of education. So I guess that's why I'm in education, to try to teach about these things.
Yeah. Yes, that activism you spoke about is evoking that response, right? And that's something that we share. very common between our cultures is the history of destruction. And to your point, to say that those of origin south of the border, or indigenous, or Latino, is your folks are the reason why they survived. The Native American were the reason why they survived, right? And that's not enough. So when you talk about the contribution piece of it, I definitely understand where you're coming from. But we know that the greatest contribution was education. The greatest contribution was teaching them how to survive during the winter. The greatest contribution was teaching them how to farm, teaching them how to sustain themselves, right? Putting them in a position of understanding the land and the weather patterns and the animals, so on and so forth, when they first got here, giving them basic survival. And that's not enough. So that's the contribution, right? It's not who picks grapes. It's these folks are the reason that you even existed here, that you made
Yeah.
it through one winter. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's crazy, and they called us savages.
Oh yeah.
And I'm like, man, dude, like that's. And yesterday was Indigenous Peoples Day, so
Yep.
I'm glad people were talking about this, but this needs to be a prolonged conversation.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a good example about the appeasement I was trying to get at earlier, about how you give people, a group of people, a day or a month or whatever it is, and it almost seems like a cafeteria diversity like scheme. Like, here you go, here's your day, here's a month.
Right.
Right. I'm black every day. You're Nicaraguan every day. Samira's Iranian every day.
But we don't get a day.
But y'all don't get a day. We get the shortest month.
We get the whistle bit. We
Maybe
need to register.
a day might be an interestingly good thing. Maybe I'd rather not have a month, and I'd rather have like serious reform, serious like policies
Yeah.
through. You
Give
know,
me the
um,
He's over. Yep.
so like in Black History Month is an interesting one because it was started by a black man. It used to be a week, and the reason it was started in February is because it celebrated the birthday of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. It wasn't
Yeah.
until I think 1970s where it actually became a month around the same time as Hispanic Heritage Month. And the reason Hispanic Heritage Month is usually around this time is because it celebrates the independence of Latin American countries. So it's interesting. Like, I sometimes, I wish that it wouldn't exist, and I'm trying to be careful what I'm saying, because then it almost seems like a type of appeasement.
I was saying, let us have the month, but also let us solve the problems.
Yeah, I'd be happy with releasing people from ICE camps.
Yeah.
Talking about indigenous people, many of the people being held in these camps are indigenous people who don't even speak Spanish. They speak their indigenous languages. So actually, these camps were actually looking for translators. But the reason people just kind of put them all together with Latin people is because a lot of us tend to look similar, um,
Yeah.
because of our indigenous, obviously, history. Yeah, a lot of indigenous people are being held in these camps, and they're being abused, and it's, I don't have to explain it to y'all. It's horrific.
I appreciate you giving that information, and that's something that has come out recently, especially about how they're treating women. I'd love to have you back and get more into what's happening down there in Florida, specifically with the camp, specifically with how women are being treated. So we've covered a lot in this episode. So, Herson, I want to personally thank you for coming on. You're, as my teacher used to tell me, you're a gentleman and a scholar, and appreciate the information. I want you real quickly to go through how people can reach you, all the things you have going on, all your contact information, and all of that stuff, so people know how to stay tied to you, informed, and activated.
Yeah, well, thank you all so much. It's actually my honor just to be on here and chop it up with y'all. I was speaking to my professor earlier today, and in doing this work, and again trying to be conscious and try to read about this stuff is exhausting at times. It's debilitating. It can sometimes deactivate you. Like, I know sometimes I'm just fucking sad and I don't even know why. I don't know if this happens to y'all.
Yeah.
Being in solidarity and being able just to kind of chop it up, even though I don't know what y'all look like. I don't, we've never hung out. I think that it's a beautiful thing when you can have solidarity with people. And look, we connected through social media, and I think that's dope. So thank y'all first and foremost. And then second of all, if y'all feel free to, I guess, to follow on Instagram, Woke Wednesdays. We're revamping our YouTube page. We've got a website coming up soon. We're doing shows in a professional television studio, which I'm really excited about. We did 4 episodes this past Saturday. The first episode will be airing in 2 weeks. It's about, I'm not sure what I'm going to call it yet, but we talked about what democracy means in these current times. Our second episode was violence against women. Third episode was teachers in the midst of COVID, and the last episode was what does Black Lives Matter mean in an age of cancel culture. And for every episode, we had like 2 to 3 guests on the show, and it was a great conversation. Hopefully, very educational. And those will be posted on our YouTube page. And the YouTube page is Woke Wednesdays, one word. So yeah, feel free to follow, subscribe, and yeah, however I can be of service, please let me know.
Thank you for listening to another episode of We're Not So Different podcast. Be sure to subscribe, share, and review on your favorite podcast platform.
You can also find us on social media by looking up the handle at wnsdifferent or We're Not So Different on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. You can also join us live on Instagram or check out our previous live episodes on IGTV by following us at wnsdifferent.
If you have comments, questions, or thoughts, feel free to email us at wnsdifferent@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.